Oh, great. It's really nice to see so many familiar names and folks online. I see some classmates also, so that's really nice to see everybody. And um, yeah, it would be lovely if we could all be gathered in Mondale Hall for the celebration, but this will do for this weekend. It's nice to be able to connect with folks who maybe are outside the Twin Cities also. So thank you everybody for making the time to join us, and happy Alumni Week to all of our alumni. If you'd like to, I'd like to introduce or invite you to kind of note in the chat if you want to say hello, kind of who you are and where you're checking in from. I'd welcome you to do that in the chat while we get started. I'm Amanda Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center. I'm also class of 2009. And so it's special for me. It's always nice to get to talk about the center with alumni, and I feel kind of part of both of those groups. And we're really glad to have some time in the schedule for the Alumni Week this year to be able to look at the work of the center in supporting Professor Fionnuala Ní Aoláin in her role as UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. Our kind of hope for today is that we can do a presentation of that work and leave some time for questions and answers also. Before I turn it over to Ben and Professor Ní Aoláin, I'll just say a word about the center. And any of you who know me know that I love to talk about the history of the center, but I will restrain myself today. But just to make the point that the center was founded in 1988 and was founded by Professor David Weisbrot. And I'm assuming maybe some of you on the call have had your own experience working with some of our human rights faculty or with the center programming. So for decades now, kind of generations of law students that have come through the school have had the type of training in human rights work, both internationally and here in Minnesota. So there's this great history and community of human rights work at the law school, and we're really proud to be able to share some of that with you today. The center is a research institute, so we're housed inside the law school, really focused on high impact research and policy work. But we're unique when it comes to academic centers because we have a very clear teaching mission. So law students are involved in all the work that the center does. So all the different range of work that the faculty do, we have students involved in all of that. So this is a great chance today to get to see a really exciting example of that work with Professor Ní Aoláin. I will not say too much more about the center now. If there's questions at the end, we'll be glad to talk about that. But I think it would be nice to get into the conversation about the work today. Professor Ní Aoláin has been a professor at the law school since 2004. I'm wondering maybe some of you have studied with her. And since 2016, she's been directing the Human Rights Center. She was also named a Regents Professor by the university. That's the highest distinction that the university awards its faculty. So we're really proud of that. And since 2017, she's been serving in the role as the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. We're joined by Ben Rogers today, who's one of Professor Ní Aoláin's research assistants and a 3L at the law school. So we're really excited to get into the conversation today. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Ní Aoláin.
Thank you, Amanda. It's really nice. I'm looking at the participant list. I see many former students. I also see my colleague, Laura Cooper, who's also a huge supporter of our center, and many of you who we've crossed paths with over the years. So really glad to be here. I am going to start right in. I'm going to share my screen because the goal of today really is to share the work of the mandate that I hold. And let me just make sure the technology works. And we did work before, so it better work now. There we go. Yeah. And we'll get rid of all of the things like student tech lists. There we go. So I have both before and since I joined the University of Minnesota Law School, my work has been primarily in the area of international law. I'm an international law scholar and practitioner, and I have written most of my work and policy work has been in the human rights, law of armed conflict, international criminal law arena. And I spent much of my life in Belfast before coming to Minnesota. So it's probably not by accident that the work that I have been doing has an intersection with systemic structural violence in many parts of the world. And in particular, the particular challenges that terrorism and related phenomena like violent extremism or radicalization more recently pose for societies. So maybe just to say a little bit about the mandate in terms of how one ends up being a special rapporteur. So I was appointed through a political process, and that process is through the United Nations Human Rights Council. And some of you will know that council. It's a UN body based in Geneva. And the United States has just rejoined that council after a period of absence. And the goal of the council is really to be the political body of states that oversees the promotion and protection of human rights around the world and standard sets and holds states accountable. Now, there's a lot to criticize when we look at the scale of human rights violations happening around the world, but there's also really significant work being done. And part of the mandate that I hold, I think, is part of sharing the work that's done. So as an independent expert, you're appointed by states. But once you're appointed, I was appointed as an Irish special rapporteur. But I don't represent Ireland. I sit on the sit as an independent expert. And I have, in the first instance, you get a 3-year term. And for better or worse, I was reelected to my second 3-year term this August. So I have another couple of years to go. A little bit of sort of the core, I don't want to say powers of a special rapporteur, because that would make me sound like someone like a superwoman who has lots of power and power to be exercised. We have what you might better call capacities. And those capacities include the 3 following key things. The first is that individuals can submit, or groups can submit, letters of appeal or allegations of human rights violations to the mandate. There's on the website link that you see there, there's a little box. It's an address. It literally those appeals go to that address. And as special rapporteur, I and my team then have to decide which cases, which letters, which communications we will deal with. And by communication, that means that we communicate with a government about allegations of a serious human rights violation. In the case of counterterrorism, for me, that has included things like identifying what we believe to be credible allegations of persons, for example, being on drone strike lists, and urging, in particular, in this case, the United States to refrain from the arbitrary deprivation of life. In other cases, for example, I'm going to use the example of Turkey as an example. We've been involved with and communicating extensively with the Turkish government about the use of counterterrorism measures against academics, civil society actors, and political individuals simply engaging in political life. We've been involved in the very high-profile case in Saudi Arabia, where a very prominent women human rights activist, Loujain, was charged with terrorism-related offenses for arguing on behalf of women's rights. So that is sort of a sense of the universe. We have hundreds of cases. And I am a full-time law professor and a part-time special rapporteur, and I have a very small team. So one of the hardest things we have to do is make choices around which cases we take up and which we don't. The second thing that a mandate holder can do is undertake fact-finding missions to particular countries. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a minute. And we've done a number of those. One of the biggest challenges right now is COVID. I'm usually on the road a lot. And right now we haven't been on the road. It's really been hard to do that kind of nitty-gritty fact-finding. The third thing that we do is submit annual reports to the United Nations Human Rights Council and General Assembly. So that happens once in the fall, once in the spring. And I often joke with my students that one of the reasons why I cold call them and why the Socratic method is an integral part of my teaching is it's teaching them to be ready for the day when the Russian Federation or the Chinese government is fast firing questions at you at the Human Rights Council, and you have to be able to answer them adequately. So I don't know if that's good preparation or bad preparation, but that's what it is. So here are the mandate's terms of reference. These are found in a resolution of the Human Rights Council, and this is a lovely picture of the United Nations, the building in Geneva with all of the flags of various UN members in front of it. So I make recommendations to states. I provide technical and advisory assistance to states that involves often working with intelligence agencies, with the military, with the police, with the key actors who are involved in counterterrorism space at the national level. I gather information. I often request information from governments to clarify their practices. A lot of what I do or try to do is to promote best practice, because even though my role has a role in criticizing government, sometimes the best way to get a government to change its practice is to acknowledge where it's doing well or to encourage a state to do better. So I think there's a limited, criticism is important. Name and shame has its role, but it's only one tool in the toolbox that you have. And one of the things that as special rapporteur I do is try to build relationships with states and with governments. And so this goes to the last part of this kind of idea of dialogue, that your role is both public and private. So one of the things for me as special rapporteur that was one of the kind of quick learning moments is I've spent most of my life as an academic. I've sometimes stepped outside of academia to be a policymaker. I've done that, for example, when I went to work at the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia as a prosecutor. I have taken time out of academia to work for international organizations. But I've never been taught how to be a diplomat. So one of the things that you learn really quickly becoming special rapporteur is you have to literally channel what junior diplomats learn over a period of a lifetime before they become an ambassador or a senior government official into finding yourself in that role essentially instantly and having to learn how to do that well. So let me take you to the next slide. I've talked a lot about Geneva. One of the things I want to stress is that post 9/11, and this is actually, it's a really important note that we're now coming up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Post 9/11, a huge architecture of counterterrorism was built at the United Nations. And that architecture sits in two places that are represented on this kind of multi-dimensional chart that I'm sharing with you. The first is the Security Council, which a lot of you will know about already, whether you took international law at law school or not. But beneath that, there are a whole range of other new committees that are all new post 9/11. The most important of which is a committee you've never heard of, but is probably one of the most powerful entities in the UN system, the Counterterrorism Committee. This is an exact replica of the Security Council, where issues around terrorism and counterterrorism get decided. And if the Security Council is often perceived to be ineffective, one thing I can tell you from close and ongoing work with the Counterterrorism Committee is that this is the place where there's a high degree of consensus among states. Counterterrorism has been one of the few areas where states of all hues take a similar line. And one of the challenges from a human rights perspective is this space on the Security Council side of the House has been a human rights light or a human rights free space. And some of the most egregious practices that we've seen in the past 20 years, things like extraordinary rendition, systemic torture, arbitrary detention, have really been facilitated and enabled by decisions that took place in the Security Council, as well as by national decisions by individual governments, including the US government. On the other side of the House, this is the Secretary General. You've got a new office called the Office of Counterterrorism, run by an Undersecretary General. And this again is an enormous architecture. The office I hold sits as, it says here, 38 entities. I am considered an entity in that process. So in addition to all of the work we do with states, I sit on I guess the current count is 10 UN committees that work on issues related to the regulation of counterterrorism globally. So it's a lot. And as my research assistant, Ben, will tell you, they are kept super busy trying to keep up with me. Let me say a little bit about country visits, because I think those will be interesting. So this is an example of the way country visits, talk a little bit about how it's set up. Some countries have an open policy of visiting, meaning some like Belgium is a good example, where they say they generally invite and support special rapporteurs visiting and assessing. And I should say that visiting is if you're a state, is a highly stressful experience for a state. You're letting a senior official or a political appointee come in and assess your entire political, legal, judicial system and issue a public report on how well you are doing in your compliance with human rights measures. And for many states, particularly in the area of counterterrorism, which is probably one of the most sensitive areas because it touches on national security and sovereignty for the state, allowing a special rapporteur in to have that kind of engagement with your security forces, your intelligence agencies, with your courts is very, very, I would say, it's just very, it makes that state quite vulnerable. And so one of the things that we require when I negotiate a visit and my team negotiates with a visit, we have a number of conditions that we ask the government to ensure. One is freedom of movement, including ensuring that I can get from A to B across a country. Now, in a small country like Belgium, that's okay, and fairly easy. But in a country like Kazakhstan, for example, which is enormous and essentially is almost, it crosses a continent, getting from A to B, particularly when we were visiting prison sites, is very difficult. What also happens is when you visit a country that's a conflict site, and the mandate I hold is often invited to visit places that are in conflict, where counterterrorism issues are at their height. So Syria, Iraq would be good examples. One of the key issues is your security. And I travel with a team in country that includes interpreters, my legal advisors. Unfortunately, the dean doesn't let students come, because many of my students might like to come to such places, but I have a diplomatic passport. Students don't. There are all kinds of risks associated with that, but we often will have a security team traveling with us. Once we're in country, the government commits to giving freedom of inquiry and freedom of access. And most particularly where that can be really important is on prisons. And so in the last couple of years since becoming special rapporteur in country visits, I always visit a number of prisons. Generally, we don't tell the government in advance which prisons we're visiting, because there's an unfortunate tendency for the people you want to talk to be moved if you tell them in advance where you're going to be or unavailable. And of course, as you would rightly guess, most of the individuals that I have met with over the last couple of years are obviously, they've been either convicted of or pending processes on terrorism. And primarily, we've been doing a lot of visits with what are called foreign fighters or foreign terrorist fighters, jihadis for the most part, who have been in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, what it means when you go in with, you don't bring any, the government doesn't come in, you walk into a cell, usually on your own with an interpreter. So I think it's challenging work, and often you're making assessments about the risks to yourself and the risks obviously to your team that are traveling with you, or the interpreter who has to. I might feel like I'm okay to walk in, but if I have an interpreter who's feeling unsafe, then of course I have responsibility to make sure my team is safe. And the other big piece of this is often when you're in a country where there are serious and grave human rights violations being undertaken under the parameter of countering terrorism, people who meet you face enormous risks. And so one of your biggest challenges as a UN mandate holder is that the fact that you have the blue badge, that you arrive in the white truck, often people feel like they're safe because they're talking to you. But the reality is that the minute you leave that country, you can provide zero assurances that person will be safe by having spoken with you. So we try to have really clear guidance, and we very clear to governments that we take reprisals really seriously. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So just to say quickly, when we visit, we do an invitation or a request, we prepare, and my students do a lot of work in helping me prepare for visits to countries by researching country-specific settings, by preparing memos on particular issues. Then I conduct the visit. And afterwards, I report to the Human Rights Council. And that is this gorgeous and beautiful room where I give my reports every year in Geneva. And this is the space where states sit and then get to grill you on your findings. And of course, the state you visit has a right of response, both in writing and orally, to your report. And many states will obviously exercise that right if there's been serious negative findings about them. A couple of things about what the work I've been focused on in the last couple of years involves. So when I became SR, I identified 4 key areas that I was going to focus my attention on. The first is the proliferation of permanent states of emergency and the normalization of exceptional national security regimes within ordinary legal systems. And I do want to say I gave a report on this issue to the Human Rights Council in 2017, the year I was appointed. But one of the things that my team is tracking, and in fact, 2 of my RAs, not Ben, but 2 other students in our team have been doing, is helping us track during COVID an increased use of counterterrorism and security powers to handle this health emergency. And so, of course, we're all on Zoom. We're all feeling quite afraid. And there are lots of things that people give up when they're afraid, which include some of their fundamental liberties. So the mandate is very focused on what happens if there's a day after, and what it means for governments to be using these kinds of exceptional powers built in a security space to a health context. The second thing I have been looking at is human rights and security regimes. And I guess I would call this second box a box about governance. And the governance box is really related to this slide. What's been happening to the growth, the proliferation of the architecture of counterterrorism around the world. And I've talked a little bit about the UN, but that's not only happening at the UN, it's happening regionally. So the Shanghai framework, there's something called the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which was meeting at 5 a.m. this morning. So I've had an early start today, meeting with over 60 states in that forum online. But we've seen a proliferation of institutions of terrorism, and I am profoundly concerned about the impact that has had on the rule of law and human rights across the globe. The third area, I'm a feminist international lawyer, and I made a commitment to gendering the work I do as special rapporteur. And this spring, I just issued a report on the gendered effects that counterterrorism measures have on women, girls, and families to the Human Rights Council. So I'd be happy to talk about some of my findings in the Q&A if folks are interested. The final area that I focused on when I was appointed was this civil society. So one of the trends that I have, and my 2 predecessors, I should say I'm the first female special rapporteur. Generally, there are some mandates that are viewed as heavy and therefore have historically been gendered male, and held by men, both of whom have been exceptional advocates. But they and I have had an ongoing concern about the way in which counterterrorism measures and security measures across the globe have been used to target civil society, human rights defenders, women's human rights activists, persons advocating for political participation and political equality, persons advocating for ecology and environmental rights, to name but a few. And I would just in particular highlight the case of Hong Kong for you as an example of this kind of misuse of counterterrorism power. And we have had, I would say, a robust engagement with the Chinese government over the past 2 years concerning both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. But one of the things that has concerned me enormously is the shrinking of civic space and the negative impact of counterterrorism on civil society. I'm going to close by talking about just where we've gone in more recent, since my reappointment in August. There are 1 or 2 other issues that I think are particularly compelling and really important for the mandate to be focused on. And the first of these is technology and counterterrorism. We see an enormous, what I would call, datafication of counterterrorism. So a good example of that, I'm going to talk about, even though very few of us have been on planes in recent years, I'm going to give you the examples of API and PNR, Advanced Passenger Airline Information, and passenger name recognition data. So when you hand over your passport as you check in for your flight to wherever you may be going, you're also handing over, as a result of a series of UN Security Council resolutions, your API and your PNR data, not only to the airline that's checking you in, but to the government that you're leaving from, to the government that you're going to. And in some cases, some countries insist that if your airline passes over their airspace, that they get your PNR too. That would include Russia. So while many of us might feel quite comfortable in sharing our API or PNR data with Canada, maybe if you're going to Montreal for the weekend, we might have other concerns about what it would mean to have that information shared with governments who have poor human rights records and certainly no data privacy or data protection systems in place. We're also really interested in the use of databases and watch lists, who gets put on watch lists, how you get off a watch list if you've ever been put on one. But the other kind of new frontier of counterterrorism, also being sort of really accelerated by COVID, is biometric data collection. And so we have a Security Council resolution that's listed here, 2396, 2017, that requires every state on the planet to collect biometric data on its citizens. Now, imagine if you were trying to get that through the US Congress. I can pretty much guarantee you that we would not get a universal mandate on biometric data collection through Congress for a whole variety of good reasons, including constitutional protections, rule of law. But in the sort of by a very swift pen writing, we do have a Security Council resolution that requires states to do that. And many states are doing that. So many of us, I think, would rightly be concerned about the collection of our intimate biometric data by government and the storage, use, and transfer of that data to other governments. Let me stop there. What I would like to do now, I'll just flag, we're doing a lot of work on technology platforms. We've had an ongoing discussion with Facebook about how it regulates its platform. And so that's part of this broader technology space. But let me pause, and I'm going to really invite Ben. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to invite Ben, who's graduating 3L, Ben Rogers, who's been one of my just exceptional students. He's a superstar. And also on that basis, as well as just his all-roundedness and the wide variety of experiences he had before coming to law school, to talk a little bit about what it means to work as a research assistant to a special rapporteur at the law school, to talk about the team of research assistants we have, and also just Ben will be graduating and will be joining the Navy JAG Corps. He'll be on active duty as of October. So I'm really pleased that he's leaving law school with a job and is going to be in service of his country. And we should all thank him for that too. So Ben, over to you.
Sure. Not sure how exceptional I am, but my mom would be incredibly proud to hear that introduction. So my work with the mandate has been wide and varied and incredibly exciting. I guess I'll just start by saying, the magnitude of the kind of work that Professor Nina Lane does with her mandate and the ability as a student to interact with it I can't tell you how many times I've looked over at my fiance after getting an assignment with my jaw off the floor, like, I get to work on this. That's just so huge and important, and just how exciting it is to be involved in things that are just so important. So like I said, my work's been personally wide and varied. It's run the gamut of substantive focus. Sometimes it's really more minutia oriented, like taking notes at events. Sometimes it's more administrative, like actually organizing or helping to run those events with international stakeholder organizations, country reps, civil society. And then my larger projects, and I think this is probably true for all of the RAs, are usually more substantively robust, but also run the gamut in scope. So I've been involved in doing some visual advocacy and graphic designs that were meant to kind of package and carry some of the important messages of the mandate, and give a kind of a deeper impact, especially for multilingual societies where graphics might translate a little bit easier than really, really verbose or dense legal wording. And then on the purely legal side, I mean, just so many things. I've been involved with helping the UN OHCHR, so that's the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. A group of them from New York were working on developing guidance for best practices when engaged in the prescription of terrorist organizations and people. So that's kind of like the professor was just saying blacklisting certain people as contributing to terrorism, and recognizing kind of when it's appropriate and how it's appropriate to do that, and the impacts that it might have on people's freedoms of association and assembly. I got to put together a memo on kind of whether there was fire or just smoke from kind of the UN counterterrorism community related to some pretty seriously vocalized concerns about regulating sales of uncrewed aircraft systems, so like drones, because of their potential to be misused by bad actors in Syria or other conflict zones. So worries about maybe attaching an IED to a drone and then dropping it in a discrete area, and trying to keep those from the hands of bad actors, and just kind of engaging with the actualities of and scope of whether that threat existed, how serious it was, and how seriously we needed to be responding to it. I actually proofread and helped cite an academic article on the discussions of soft law and how that's kind of changed in the counterterrorism sphere, and how in the counterterrorism sphere, soft law very quickly becomes or takes on the idea of hard law without a ton of checks and balances, and kind of just being reactive to and recognizing that. Most recently, I just got an assignment to do some work on ISIS in Syria, and just kind of charting or noting the military activities that are taking place in Northeast Syria, and how that may affect the integrity and safety of camps controlled by the SDF. And also the professor was just mentioning her country visit to Kazakhstan, and she had a follow-up visit at the beginning of the fall semester with the prime minister. And, last minute I got asked to put together kind of a report of certain points that she had interest in, and seeing kind of how they've implemented her recommendations so that she could actually, with, understanding and up-to-date notice, kind of call on the prime minister and check in on how they were doing implementing her recommendations. So all in all, a very, very robust, holistic experience, just kind of getting my hands dirty in the actual work of international human rights and counterterrorism. And importantly, in a way that I don't think I could have done at a different school or with a different professor, doing it where that work is actually happening and where it actually matters with the people that actually matter in it. Just a bit about our RA group. We're a group of about 10 RAs. I think it may fluctuate up and down depending on the semester. But we each kind of have very particular interests and kind of niche areas of, I won't go so far as to say expertise, but places that we're probably hopeful to become experts. And so we kind of manage work in a way that we try to, I think, route it in a way that's somewhat symbiotic. So things that will maybe be better suited to certain personnel gets routed to those personnel, because it not only makes sure that the mandates work is better and more efficient to have the people that know those things working on them, but it also probably helps the student's own personal growth as a budding professional. Of course, we also kind of track our work with each other to kind of see how our bandwidth is doing. We've got a live document that we kind of see what people are working on, where they've done work. And given the fact that I'm sure it's no surprise that law school students are not exactly the model of constant, steady availability. It's kind of a fluctuating movement there to see who's able to kind of hop in and make sure that we have even distribution. And then lastly, I think there's a kind of a familial and a social aspect to when Professor Neil Lane will put out kind of an all hands open call for certain students to pick up the torch and carry on a project. I think we all we know the magnitude of what the mandate's doing and want to kind of be seen contributing and participating. I don't think, that's not to say that there's not a ton of work for the mandate, but I don't think I've ever seen a project call go for longer than 12 hours without being picked up by somebody that said, yes, I want to be involved in this. This is super hugely important. So yeah, I think that's just kind of my spiel on what I've been involved in and how we kind of get work done. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like me to chat about.
No, that's really great, Ben. I want to say that like the work I do would not get done without my research assistants. That's the truth. And I've been extraordinarily lucky at the university that I've had this incredible, over the years, extraordinary students come through who have gone on to serve in government, who've gone on, some of them to work in private firms, but continue to have this relationship with human rights and the rule of law. A number of my students have gone on to serve in the military or have come to law school after the military, bringing enormous experience in the area of work that I do. And that's been really gratifying. And I think we do work as a team, and it's kind of a bit of a baptism of fire for students to come into this space sometimes when there's like 700 things happening at once. But I think the other thing that I really like has been that over the years, many of the students who've worked with me as research assistants have built relationships in the team that they work in, and that is sort of endures past law school. So part of their formative experience of being in law school has been working in this really tight policy global team with really concrete outcomes to try to really change things in the world. And I hope they go into practice with that vision of change. So I'll stop. And I know, Amanda, you're going to throw some questions, and we'd really invite either to Ben or to myself. I don't know, you could ask us anything, like the most interesting jihadi we've met, or maybe work-life balance questions, or anything related to this or anything else.
Yeah, and feel free to write those questions in the Q&A or the chat. And I'll say one thing that I think really makes Minnesota stand out is with the support of the Human Rights Center, we're able to, these research opportunities for students are paid. And that's been really important since the founding of the center, to have these opportunities available to all students. So not only students that are able to do kind of extra pro bono work, but making sure that these are paid opportunities for students to get this kind of hands-on experience. So we're proud of that. And maybe we could turn first to Jim's question here. Jim's asking about any work the mandate's done with the US government on drones.
We have. So across a number of to the sort of last administration, I came in at the end of the Obama administration, and then through the Trump administration, and now obviously the Biden administration. A couple of things. One, we've had a number of individual communications on drones where individuals who were identified to me primarily in Yemen as being likely targets for the use of drones. We've issued public communications with the government. We've also dialogued with the government on those cases. I can't say very much about the nature of that dialogue, but we've been very concerned, obviously, about extrajudicial execution, particularly the targeting of US citizens outside the territorial boundaries of the United States, but also more broadly, the broader issue of civilian targeting in the use of drones. This month is actually a really important month for that conversation. Vietnam is holding the presidency of the UN Security Council and are proposing a resolution on the protection of civilians, which the mandate has been engaged with them about, in particular focused on the use. It will also include this question of the use of drones, trying to get and strengthen international protections. So we've been involved on individual cases. We've had bilateral discussions with the US government about its guidance, policy, and practice, as well as guidance as conversations with the Security Council and with other states about reminding the United States of its obligations under the auspices of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Yeah.
Great. And another question that we have here from Sam, who supported the mandate also previously. Could you say something about a country or countries that you've worked with or visited or reported on that's been really receptive to the recommendations?
Hi, Sam. Sam is another one of the veterans in mutual sense, but a veteran of the RA group that has worked with me and my team and my legal advisor. Sam was research assistant to my legal advisor, Christina Hertz-Arban, when she was at the center. And I should say, I have two full-time legal advisors, one of whom is full-time based at the Human Rights Center. So in addition to me, we also have another very competent international lawyer working on these issues. So in terms of countries, Sam, I would say that the country that has been the most compliant of the visits I have done has been Belgium. We had a really extraordinary dialogue with Belgium. And just to remind folks who are on the call, Belgium, as many of you might know, had a really, really horrific series of terrorist attacks in Molenbeek, in a train station and at the airport a number of years ago. Significant loss of civilian life, really extraordinary hardship for those, and long-term, as well as those who died, really, really enormous impact on the victims who survived. And we were able to visit Belgium. We had a number of recommendations. My mandate does a lot of work on victims of terrorism. I should say that in every country I go to, I meet with victims of terrorism as a priority. I was really concerned that Belgium's systems of support, both legal, psychosocial, and medical, to victims of terrorism was inadequate. And so it's really unusual to have a government say, we agree up front, hands up. And so, but part of what helped them was my really staunch criticism of what they were doing or not doing to support victims of terrorism, then prompted a huge and significant number of domestic legal reforms. So that's just a really good example of a synergy between a government's goodwill, the effect of external pressure, and then ongoing dialogue. I've had 2 return visits to Belgium, again, to meet with the government, to talk to them and help them. And that's less public. That's really about me supporting them to do this work. So that's a really good example. The other place where we've had really good experience with government is Kazakhstan. And my report on Kazakhstan was very critical in a number of respects, but one of the places we were very positive on Kazakhstan's work was its returnee policy to women and children who've been held in camps in Syria and Iraq. And so we just had a really engaged, positive, and active dialogue with them around that work and their continued work in that area. So those are examples of just actually very concrete things following, and then ongoing dialogue and engagement and practical assistance to the government.
Thanks. And we have a couple of great questions coming in. Maybe I'll ask you to say something, and I'd be curious if both of you, what your thoughts on this, a little bit about balancing the rights protections and the really important counterterrorism goals, and how do you kind of work in addressing both of those considerations? So the question refers specifically to the right to privacy, to data, and the importance of counterterrorism goals.
So, I mean, I believe security is a human right. So I don't start from the protection that rights and security are 2 separate things. This is maybe because I grew up in a place where violence was a kind of a really consistent part of my growing up experience. So I don't think those 2 things are separate. But I also think that when you peel off counterterrorism from human rights, it's not only a moral and ethical issue, it's actually a practical issue. It doesn't work. And in fact, 20 years after 9/11, where we've had 20 years of human rights like counterterrorism, I think one of the biggest challenges facing us globally is that actually it's not working. We've securitized responses, not failed to address the conditions that produce violence, many of which are socioeconomic, educational, marginalization, and the pathways to exclusion and anomie that lead to violence aren't resolved by the use of hard CT measures. Those have a place, but in my view, they have a really narrow place, not merely because human rights is the right and moral thing to do, but also because it actually doesn't work. And we have, I think, very good data to show that. I think in terms of privacy, one of the challenges we're facing right now is the dearth or the lack of privacy. People talk about a right to privacy, but in practice in the security area, it doesn't really exist. So a good example is the European system has a GDPR, which some of you will know about if the lawyers are on the call know about GDPR and data protection, but national security is the carve out. So even in places that have strong data protection, it doesn't apply to things that are put in the terrorism or security box. And I think the problem with that is that in so many countries, what is defined as terrorism is legitimate activity under international law. It includes protest, speech, the right to family life, the right to practice your religion. So the point is that we have to be really clear about what is or is not terrorism. And then we have to be really clear about what the absence in practical terms means. I don't know, Ben, did you want to add something about balances or any thoughts on balances?
Well, just to say that we have rules that, all of these activities should be strictly necessary and proportionate, and those are there for a reason. And so just like in the question asked, like there is a balance that has to be struck. And if we're allowing the counterterrorism realm to run roughshod over the balance of other human rights, then we're not striking that balance. There's a reason that there's necessary and proportionate guidelines there for when we do invade human rights in order to counter terrorism. And it's just a matter of actually implementing that balance, right? And growing up as a child who was in 7th grade when 9/11 hit, I totally get the need for security and the absolute, sensationalization of wanting to counter terrorism. But we have to recognize too that like a lot of the counterterrorism measures we make, like Professor Nina Lane said, not only are not working, but in a lot of instances are sometimes the cause of creating these radicalized ideals in certain areas of the world. So it's just that balance, just like in the question. I think you have to try. I think that's the first place, is that we have to ask the counterterrorism sphere to try to balance and start there.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think that's a great ask, a great starting point. I'll turn now to the question from Jan Wernes, which is if you could just say a little bit more about gender in this work, and I think all of the expertise that you bring into this role for your previous work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, the report that we issued to the Human Rights Council this summer started from the premise of the gendered space that is national security. And I mean, literally the bodies who inhabit that space. So often, of course, when I come into the room, my team, my RAs are mixed, but my legal team are all women lawyers. So we often show up as the only females in the national security room. And so that's interesting itself, just in terms of representation. Do women see themselves in national security spaces? And what does it mean to be a woman in a national security space? And what kind of better policies would we produce if we had more? We're having this broader discussion in the United States right now about producing better policy through diverse voices and diverse understandings of problems. So that's the first piece, is representation. The second is just to recognize the extent to which, when we have really broad definitions of terrorism, and that's one of the really major challenges post 9/11, is that many states legislate any criticism of the government as terrorism. And so one of the big gender pieces we're seeing is the targeting of women HRDs, human rights defenders, women advocates, as terrorists or national security threats. And so that's a really clear use of CT measures in a gendered way, and often the kinds of ways in which women will experience detention, particularly if they have children or if they're pregnant, or the kinds of violences that women may experience, particularly sexual and gender-based violence in those incarcerated contexts, are really enormous. I think the other things that we have looked at, and again, maybe these are sort of bringing agenda. So we talk about something like countering terrorism finance, which is an area that I do quite a bit of work on. And people would say, well, that's not gendered. You're just taking money away from the bad guys. Again, I go back to the definition of terrorism. In many countries, countering terrorism finance legislation is used against civil society organizations. Turkey is a good example of that, or Egypt. And we've been engaged in a robust dialogue with those states about their use of those measures. But one of the things, for example, the mandate pointed out in its report is that when you target them, often the target is a man. But in countries where, for example, women can't alienate property or don't have right of access to bank accounts or don't have independent resources, the impact of a countering terrorism finance measure doesn't fall solely on the individual targeted. It falls generally in a gendered way on women and on the children and the care dependencies that those women have. So if you don't see that gendered effect, you will only think it's targeting one person. In fact, the structure of society and the inequalities of society mean that it is particularly targeting women in ways that we might not see. Maybe finally to say one of the biggest gender issues, the one that the mandate's been really preoccupied with, is the situation of women and children in camps in northeast Syria. We've been expending an enormous amount of energies on this issue. There are over 60,000 third country nationals being held in a situation of arbitrary detention in subhuman camps in the arid deserts of northeast Syria. And no one has been through a legal process to detain them. And again, this is like a Guantanamo for women because it's only women and children who are being held there. And we've been really concerned about the failure, in particular, of Western governments to engage.
I have another great question here, and it's not unrelated to questions of gender, but maybe you could say a little bit about how governments see you. Do they see you with a UN identity or an academic or Irish or from the US, or how are governments seeing you in these interactions?
I suppose the answer is it depends, right? So I think we do a lot of work to engage with governments across a very wide spectrum. So the assumption might be that the governments that we work with are the human rights friendly democratic states. And of course, we have good relationships with many governments who are self-defined democracies. But I would say that in this area, we have many governments who self-define as democracies who behave egregiously in the human rights arena related to counterterrorism. A good example is the fact that we still have over 40 detainees at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, only one of which has been ever charged and convicted of a crime, many of whom essentially are being kept in arbitrary Kafkaesque detention with no likely means that they will ever be released. And that happens in a leading democracy which says that it supports the rule of law and due process. We build relationships with states precisely because often our best allies are different on different issues, and so oddly enough, I think the answer to this question is that my goal is to have a wide variety of relationships with different governments, and I work really hard to that end. And I will say there are governments that we've criticized, but someone described my mandate as an equal opportunities criticizer. So the fact is that nobody gets a buy. And that's really in some ways the line for your own fairness, that you are consistent in applying your standards across the board.
Great. And now I'm going to abuse my privilege here as moderator and see if I can ask Ben. Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. I'm curious if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit about kind of your trajectory for your career, like what you think about long-term for your work, and has kind of the experiences that you've had in law school with the mandate or other, like how's that shaped what you envision for your career path?
Sure. I came to law school from running a nonprofit organization, an international organization for kids with special needs and their families, and expected my route through law school to be kind of what we consider domestically civil rights, to be fighting for people with disabilities or for racial discrimination, and to just be fighting discrimination in general. Once here, though, and kind of finding out that there was a route to do public service in the sphere of international law, criminal law, kind of in where those two overlap and intersect, was kind of ambition altering for me. So originally I wanted to do civil rights and discrimination work, and I still think, I can have a say in that, especially through a major organization and doing leadership through the Navy. But I just think that, as I've gone through law school and interacted with the classes from Professor Neil Lane in international criminal law and international law and human rights, this is the place where, we talk about doing the work that matters where it matters. And I think it's really easy to be siloed in your particular areas and particular places. I think that we have a very, very American-centric ideal in America about what matters. And broadening that horizon to international considerations has really, really changed my ambition. My trajectory, working as a judge advocate means that I'll be involved in both criminal defense and prosecution, perhaps teaching, perhaps being a judge, as well as interacting in administrative law and working on environmental law, as well as operational law. So like laws of war and rules of engagement, and getting involved with international conflicts. I expect that to go for, if it works out okay for me and my fiance, we hope to do that for at least 20 years and then kind of see where we end up. But the coolest thing about the Navy is that or about the JAG Corps, is that you get to experience in this realm of like international law and interaction with other countries. You get to kind of experience a wide shifting range of actual activities and jobs. So my job gets to change every 2 years. My trajectory and my geographical location changes every 2 years. So I guess my trajectory is a roller coaster, and it'll be exciting. And I wouldn't have gotten my job had it not been for my work with Professor Neil Lane. She was instrumental in providing me recommendations and experiences that made me a candidate that the JAG Corps would actually select. And I guess there's not a way to thank for that, but just to say that it has been hugely, hugely instrumental in my path and in my life, and I guess my family's, in ways that I couldn't have gotten, I don't think, at any other law school, because this kind of mandate doesn't exist at any other law school, right? So.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
That's great. And we do have several questions in the lineup here. I think we'll also follow up the event with some resources that are related to some of the topics that we covered today. So we'll what we missed, we'll be sure to try to follow up with some notes. As we're coming up on the kind of last few minutes of our conversation together, I guess I want to ask both Ben and Professor Neil Lane if you have any kind of closing words that you want to leave us with. And maybe I'll just raise Andrea's question here, which is a little bit about holding on to hope and optimism when you're really working through really tough topics and with some tough actors. So whatever you'd like to close on, but that was a nice question that came in at the end there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, if you're engaged in long-term human rights or transformative work, you have to be an optimist. There's no other course of action, really. But I also believe, I think I've said this to students, and I would say this, it's like a long game. Like anyone who thinks you're in if you're engaged in long-term social change, it's really slow work, and you'll watch the progress you made be broken down, and then you have to pick it up and start again. And so I think we have to think in terms of the long haul, the long game, and that and we have to be strategic, and that also goes to kind of conserving our energies. I mean, you can't, if you spend a lifetime committed to social change, you can't exhaust yourself in the first hour, because you won't be able to manage to sustain the kind of battles and challenges that you have. So I think partly it's about seeing the long game, and partly it's about balance. I mean, balance, we go back to that word, but enjoying your family life. I have 3 children and a spouse, and I do a lot of other things, and I try to do other things in my spare time that brings that sense of balance and a realization that this is just a really long game. The actors in the spaces never get easier. The fights get harder, and we continue to push back, as we have done for centuries, to advance the cause of rights and equality. That is the dynamic and essential nature of the work that we are in.
Not that I have the clout to give such, advice or commentary, but I guess the same thing, progress is slow, but its implications are lasting. And I think it's really important to look at the historical arc of, these small battles and what they actually mean long-term. And, I don't think although problems get more complicated and tougher to handle, I don't think anybody would say that we have made progress over the course of the last, many, many decades since the UN was implemented. I mean, the UN was implemented to solve a very, very big problem. And arguably, at least, the problem of world war hasn't officially come up again. So progress is slow, but lasting. Its implications last for a long time. And so I think looking at the long-term effects of what you're doing now, even if it seems like a small win, those small wins will carry on into the future for a very, very long time.
Well, excellent. That's a great note for us to go out on. And, we're so proud of our faculty and the students that are doing work in so many different spaces. And I hope that you all getting to hear this today feel the same. This leadership of Minnesota in human rights space that we have now, and we've had now for decades in this field. And I hope that you'll kind of follow the work of the Human Rights Center. We're really interested in connecting with all of you. I'm sure some of you are in work of your own that we can connect with. So I will look forward to the chance to continue to connect. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of Alumni Week and congratulations, especially to those that have some milestone reunions this year. And thanks everybody for the time. Thanks to Lizzie, who you can see behind the screen here, for all the work pulling this together. This was really nice to get the chance to chat with everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.